Before continuing, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other true and disturbing stories like this one. If you enjoy unsolved mysteries, cursed places, and stories that defy logic, this channel is for you. And feel free to comment on where you're watching from right now. Maybe distance is what's keeping us safe this time. The house stood silently on North 2nd Street in Atchison, Kansas, as if tired of being observed. There was nothing about it that screamed danger at first glance. The light paint, the narrow porch, the ordinary windows. Even so, something about that old building seemed out of place in the world of the living, as if time had stopped there for a reason that no one dared question anymore. Lucas Harper parked his car across the street and remained motionless for long seconds, observing the facade. He didn't believe in hauntings, at least not until that moment. A clinical psychologist specializing in dissociative disorders and mass hysteria, Lucas had built his career debunking cases considered supernatural. For him, everything had an explanation: trauma, suggestion, shared fear. Sallie House was just another academic challenge, or so he thought. The motivation for being there didn't stem from curiosity, but from reputation. The house carried decades of disturbing accounts, deep scratches appearing on visitors' skin, objects thrown against walls, children's voices echoing in empty rooms, and a presence described not as observant, but aggressive. A presence that didn't just frighten, it attacked. The antagonist in that story had no face, name, or defined form. It was known only as Sallie, some said. It was the spirit of a girl who had died there at the beginning of the 20th century after a botched surgery. Others claimed the name was just a mask, something the entity used to appear harmless before revealing its true nature. What made the case even more unsettling was the consistency of the accounts. Different people at different times describing the same manifestations. Lucas crossed the street and climbed the porch steps. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if the air around the house offered resistance. Touching the doorknob, he felt a sudden chill run down his arm, too quick to be just the wind. He ignored the sensation and went inside. The interior of the house was simple, almost suffocating. The low ceiling, narrow corridors, and dim lighting created an oppressive atmosphere. The smell was indefinable, a mixture of old wood, dust, and something metallic, similar to dried blood. Lucas took a deep breath and began setting up his equipment. Still cameras, audio recorders, motion sensors. Everything was meticulously planned. He needed data, not stories. While he was working, small noises began to emerge, cracking sounds coming from the walls, soft footsteps on the upper floor. Nothing that couldn't be attributed to the expansion of the structure or the action of the wind. Still, there was something different. The sounds weren't random. There was rhythm, intention. In the room that used to be the house's former doctor's office, Lucas felt the clearest change in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped abruptly. The air seemed thicker, making breathing difficult. It was there that, according to the records, Sallie usually manifested herself most violently. He positioned a camera near the old bed and, as he turned around, felt a sudden burning sensation on his forearm. 3 reddish marks appeared before his eyes, parallel, too deep to be explained by a simple accidental scratch. The burning sensation turned into throbbing pain. Lucas recoiled, his heart racing, trying to rationalize the impossible. He hadn't touched anything. There was no one there but him. The conflict was established, even if he still refused to accept it. On one side, his logic, his scientific training, his need for control. On the other, the house, silent, patient, hostile. Sallie House didn't react as a phenomenon to be observed. It reacted as something conscious that refused to be challenged. On the audio recorder, an almost imperceptible sound was captured at that moment. A child's voice, whispered, laden with false sweetness, repeating a single name: Lucas. Sallie House didn't reveal itself all at once. It surrendered in layers, as if each room were a silent test to measure how much someone could endure before breaking. Lucas realized this early in the evening. The longer he stayed there, the more the house seemed to awaken. He walked the corridors with measured steps, observing details that had gone unnoticed in previous research. The walls displayed irregular marks beneath the paint, old grooves, as if something had been dragged repeatedly over the years. The floorboards creaked, even when he remained still, creating the constant feeling that he was not alone. The house did not react to movement. It reacted to presence. The external environment also exerted a direct influence on the atmosphere. Atchison was a town marked by ancient stories, linked to the imagery of the Old West and a past of rudimentary medicine. At the beginning of the 20th century, surgical procedures were performed inside homes, often without adequate anesthesia. The old doctor's room in the house, where Lucas had experienced his first attack, carried this historical weight. There, pain and despair had been routine, and the house seemed to have absorbed it all. Lucas was not entirely alone in that investigation. Although he had insisted on conducting the study in isolation, he had established remote contact with Ethan Moore. Ethan, an independent researcher of anomalous phenomena who was deeply familiar with the records of Sallie House, didn't blindly believe in the supernatural, but he accepted the possibility of something beyond common understanding. This difference in attitude created a constant contrast between them. Through the walkie-talkie, Ethan's voice sounded tense, though controlled. He warned Lucas about recurring patterns in the reports. The entity usually manifested itself first subtly, almost childlike, before becoming aggressive. The change wasn't gradual. It was abrupt, as if something were being replaced by something else. Lucas listened, took notes, but remained skeptical. For him, the human mind was capable of creating far more convincing threats than any spirit. Still, the data began to defy his logic. The sensors recorded localized temperature variations, concentrated in specific points of the house. They weren't drafts, they were abrupt drops, too precise. The audio recordings captured sounds that didn't match his movements. Light footsteps, scratching, short and irregular breaths. The unseen characters in that story revealed themselves more through special effects than through appearances. Sallie, the entity, or whatever it used that name, did not manifest itself as a helpless child. There was a growing hostility, a sense of constant surveillance. Lucas began to realize that the entity reacted more intensely when he questioned its existence aloud, as if the challenge were interpreted as provocation. The house itself functioned as a character. Doors that had previously remained open began to close on their own. Objects subtly changed places, a chair slightly displaced, a book fallen where nothing had been before. Nothing spectacular, nothing explicit, just enough to erode the certainty of the observer. Ethan, on the other end of the line, brought to light accounts from former residents that had never been officially released. People who abandoned the house after episodes of inexplicable violence, waking up with deep cuts, feeling invisible hands pressing on their chests during the night. The pattern repeated itself. The presence seemed to choose targets, preferring those who tried to understand or control the phenomenon. Lucas began to become exactly that. His initially analytical demeanor began to be influenced by his surroundings. His movements became more cautious. He avoided spending too much time in the doctor's room, even knowing that the answers he sought were there. The house was shaping his decisions, limiting his actions without needing to directly reveal itself. The antagonist in that story didn't need to physically appear. Its motivation was clear. To maintain control of the space, to punish intrusion, to instill fear. Sallie wasn't an echo of the past seeking recognition. It was something active, territorial, that reacted violently to those who dared to cross its boundaries. As dawn approached, Lucas realized he wasn't just studying Sallie House. He was being studied by her. And the house seemed pleased with what it saw. Dawn was breaking, and with it came the feeling that Sallie House had stopped observing and started acting. Lucas noticed the change not because of a grand event, but because of the sudden absence of familiar sounds. The floorboards stopped creaking. The wind ceased. Even the natural crackling of the wood disappeared. The silence became heavy, concentrated, as if the house were holding its breath. He walked to the main room to check the monitors. The camera images displayed subtle distortions, shadows that appeared and disappeared without apparent origin. In one corner of the basement, something seemed to move out of the direct reach of the lens. Lucas adjusted the focus, but the interference increased, as if the equipment itself were being pushed to the brink of failure. The first real obstacle arose when the two-way radio crackled and then went completely silent. Ethan's voice disappeared abruptly without warning. Lucas tried to re-establish contact, changed the frequency, tapped lightly on the device. Nothing. The house hadn't just interrupted communication. It had isolated the investigator. The conflict was no longer theoretical. It had become physical and strategic. He decided to go down to the basement, a place associated with reports of greater violence. Each step creaked unevenly, creating the impression of footsteps following his own. The air down there was colder, heavy with humidity. The metallic smell intensified. Upon reaching the last step, Lucas felt a sudden pressure on his chest, as if invisible hands were pushing him against the wall. There was no time to react. The force ceased as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only pain and confusion. New marks appeared on his skin, deeper than the previous ones. They weren't random scratches. They formed patterns, lines that intersected in an almost deliberate way. Lucas recoiled, his body reacting before his mind could rationalize. Fear began to compete directly with his need for an explanation. The entity no longer limited itself to provoking, it was testing limits. Objects began to be thrown with restrained violence, never directly at him, but close enough to make it clear that things could get worse. A light bulb exploded in the upstairs hallway. In the doctor's room, the old bed began to creak on its own, as if someone were slowly sitting on the non-existent mattress. Lucas tried to assert control, narrating aloud everything that was happening as he did in clinical sessions. It was a defense mechanism, a way to keep his mind grounded. The reaction in the house was immediate. The walls vibrated slightly, and the temperature dropped aggressively. The audio recorder captured a clear change. The child's voice that had previously whispered now sounded distorted, multiplied, repeating incomplete phrases that made no sense but carried a threat. Secondary characters emerged only through the traces left in the space. Old photographs fell from the walls, revealing fingerprints imprinted on the back of the glass, as if someone had tried to leave. A mirror in the hallway reflected for a moment a short, motionless silhouette behind Lucas. When he turned around, there was nothing there. Looking at the mirror again, the image was cracked. The conflict escalated without repeating itself. Each manifestation brought a new dynamic: isolation, physical aggression, sensory distortion. There was no clear pattern of attack, only a calculated progression. Sallie House seemed to be testing different ways to break it, evaluating which would be most effective. The most disturbing moment occurred when Lucas found the main recorder playing audio he hadn't recorded. His own voice echoed through the device, describing pain and fear, phrases he had only thought, never uttered aloud. This wasn't just a physical threat. It was a direct invasion of his mind. He understood then that the conflict wasn't limited to surviving the night. The entity sought something deeper: to destabilize, to dominate, to impose its narrative over his. The house didn't want to be explained. It wanted to be feared. Lucas remained motionless in the center of the room, surrounded by shifting shadows, aware that every decision from then on would have immediate consequences. The investigation had turned into a direct confrontation, and Sallie House had made it clear that it would not back down. Direct violence subsided for a short period, creating a deceptive interval of stability. Lucas realized that this silence was not relief, but preparation. Sallie House seemed to alternate between attack and waiting, as if organizing something larger in the spaces between the demonstrations. This shift opened space for deeper layers of the conflict to emerge, unsettlingly linking past and present. In the makeshift office, Lucas found a wooden box hidden behind a loose panel on the wall. The object did not appear in any historical records of the house. Inside were old documents, medical letters, and personal notes belonging to a former doctor who had lived there. The pages described procedures performed without proper consent, experiments conducted in the name of science, and a growing obsession with understanding human suffering. The name Sallie appeared repeatedly, but not as a child, rather as a case, an experiment. This discovery introduced a crucial subplot, the possibility that the entity was not a child spirit, but something shaped by cruel practices, sustained by prolonged suffering. The house would not only be the stage for horror, but an accomplice. The walls would have absorbed not only death, but the intention behind it. While analyzing the documents, Lucas began to notice changes in his own perception. Time seemed unstable. His wristwatch showed different times than those displayed on the monitors. Moments repeated themselves almost imperceptibly. The same creak, the same step, the same crack, always identical. The psychological subplot deepened. The house not only attacked the body, but distorted the notion of reality. Communication with Ethan was unexpectedly re-established for a few seconds. The researcher's voice came through, fragmented, laden with interference. He mentioned having found similar accounts in other medical residencies from the same period, places where there wasn't a specific ghost, but rather a collective presence formed by accumulated pain and repeated trauma. Before he could finish, the signal dropped again. The information, however, was enough to amplify the threat. Another complexity arose when Lucas began to notice patterns in his own reaction to the house. He didn't just feel fear. There was a subtle attraction, almost a need to remain there, an irrational impulse to continue investigating, even when every instinct indicated flight. The house seemed to reinforce this behavior, lessening the attacks whenever he approached more sensitive areas, such as the doctor's room and the basement. Objects linked to the former residence began to appear out of place, rusty surgical instruments on the kitchen table, children's clothes folded on the sofa, photographs showing people without visible eyes. Each element connected the historical subplots to the current conflict, creating the feeling that Lucas was being inserted into a narrative that already existed long before his arrival. Time pressure intensified when the sensors began to fail permanently. Batteries drained in minutes. Cameras shut down without warning. The investigation was becoming unsustainable. At the same time, documents indicated that the entity's behavior became more violent when someone tried to leave the house after discovering too much. Time was not just a limited resource, it was a threat. All the subplots converged on a central point. Sallie House was not an isolated phenomenon, nor a victim seeking justice. It was a system of repetition, fueled by curiosity, pain, and permanence. And Lucas, by remaining, became an active part of this cycle. When he put the documents in his backpack, he felt the pressure in his chest again, more intense, accompanied by a whisper close to his ear. Not childish, but deep, full of command. The message was clear, even without complete words. The house didn't want him to leave. The household wanted him to stay. The event that definitively changed the course of history didn't come with screams, thrown objects, or marks on the skin. It came with clarity. Lucas was sitting on the floor of the main room, the documents spread out before him, when he realized something impossible. Some pages no longer described the past. They described the present. Dates had appeared where none had existed before. Times matched the present moment exactly. On one of the sheets, a recent note described a man resistant to initial suggestion, rational profile, tendency towards denial, followed by an unmistakable physical detail. the discreet scar Lucas had carried on his chin since adolescence. The house wasn't responding to him. She anticipated. The impact of this revelation was immediate. Lucas felt an internal shift, as if something that sustained his identity had been abruptly pulled away. He was no longer just a researcher. He was occupying a role that had already been foreseen. The antagonist ceased to be merely the invisible entity. It had become the very system that the house perpetuated, a mechanism that selected, tested, and absorbed individuals over time. The demonstrations changed in nature at that moment. The violence ceased completely. In its place, a disturbing normality emerged. The lights remained on. The walkie-talkie was working clearly again. Ethan called out Lucas's name, confused, asking why he had been silent for hours. On the monitors, no distortion. The house seemed cooperative. Lucas stood up slowly, feeling a strange lightness. The pain had lessened. The marks on his skin were less visible. The feeling of threat had been replaced by something even more unsettling: acceptance. Sallie House no longer needed to intimidate him. It had moved on to the next phase. In the doctor's room, he found the final, turning point revelation. On the old bed lay a tape recorder. Pressing the play button, he heard his own voice describing the house with clinical precision, not as a hostile place, but as a responsive environment, capable of revealing human behavioral patterns under extreme stress. The tone was calm, convicted. It was a speech he recognized, not as something he had said, but as something that I would say. The shock didn't come in the form of panic, but of understanding. The entity known as Sallie wasn't an individual consciousness. It was an interface, a name given to the process. The house attracted people with a specific profile: skeptical, analytical, obsessed with control. And by breaking them, it reused their motivations, their voices, their narratives. What attacked the living wasn't a childlike spirit, but the continuity of all those who had tried to dominate it. Lucas felt the delayed emotional reaction arrive all at once. Nausea, trembling hands, a deep fear not of dying, but of to remain conscious within something that fed on human reason. The turning point came when Ethan, on the radio, said something that shouldn't have been possible. He mentioned old reports signed by a Dr. L. Harper, dating back decades, linked to the same house, not as a victim, as a collaborator. Lucas turned off the radio. The house had ceased to be an object of study. It had revealed itself as a cycle, and he was right at the center of it. Understanding brought immediate consequences, none of which offered relief. As soon as Lucas accepted the magnitude of what he had discovered, the house responded as if recognizing this internal change, not with aggression, but with reorganization. Doors that had been locked opened. Corridors seemed longer, brighter. Sallie House no longer threatened him, it integrated him. Lucas reacted with silent resistance. He began to avoid the rooms where he felt most comfortable, forcing himself to remain in areas that still caused physical discomfort. It was a conscious effort to avoid being completely assimilated. However, each attempt at resistance generated subtle yet profound consequences. The house began to bring back memories he hadn't shared with anyone, scenes from his childhood, professional failures, ethical decisions he preferred to forget. These weren't random visions. They were fragments chosen with surgical precision. The relationship with Ethan suffered a definitive rupture. When contact was re-established, the conversation didn't follow the previous pattern. Ethan began treating Lucas as someone who already understood too much, using technical terms they had never discussed before. It was as if Lucas's narrative was already recorded in files he had never written. Every phrase heard on the radio reinforced the feeling that the outside world was being contaminated by the logic of the house. The physical consequences also manifested themselves. The marks on Lucas's body did not disappear completely. They transformed. From open wounds, they became organized, almost symmetrical scars. They were not signs of attack, but of adaptation. His body reacted to the environment as if it were learning to coexist with it. Emotionally, the impact was even more severe. The initial fear gave way to a more complex internal conflict, the temptation to accept the role being offered to him. The house didn't promise constant pain. It promised continuity, purpose, permanence. Every time Lucas considered leaving, a feeling of loss overwhelmed him, as if abandoning that place would mean giving up something essential to himself. The dynamics of the plot changed. Sallie House ceased to be merely the active antagonist and began to act as an agent of consequence. It no longer punished directly, it shaped. Every decision Lucas made reverberated throughout the space. When he tried to record events objectively, the equipment malfunctioned. When he chose to observe without interfering, everything worked perfectly. The house rewarded silent submission. The most unsettling reaction occurred when Lucas realized that his thoughts were becoming more compatible with the logic of the place. He began to formulate hypotheses not to escape, but to understand how the cycle was maintained, not out of academic curiosity, but out of necessity. It was a shift in motivation, subtle yet decisive. The ultimate consequences of that stage became clear when Lucas found the front door unlocked. The exit was there, accessible, without resistance. No sign prevented him from leaving. The absence of obstacles was, in itself, the house's greatest reaction. It no longer needed to physically hold him captive. The real test now was internal. Lucas stood by the door for long minutes, feeling the weight of the choice mounting. Sallie House didn't demand obedience. It demanded a decision, and any path taken would have an irreversible cost. Overcoming the situation didn't begin with escape, but with refusal. Lucas took a step away from the open door, not towards the house, but towards the center of the room, where everything seemed to converge. The choice wasn't motivated by courage, but by lucidity. If Sallie House fed on submission or unconscious permanence, then the only possible path was to remain without giving in. He initiated a clear change in behavior. He stopped recording phenomena by looking for patterns in the house and began observing himself. Every physical reaction, every intrusive thought, every feeling of comfort was analyzed as part of the control mechanism. This shift in focus was the first real challenge that the house had not anticipated. The response came in the form of psychological pressure. The atmosphere became unstable again, but in a different way than in previous phases. There were no direct attacks. There were attempts at disorientation, lights that changed intensity, noises that mimicked human footsteps, voices that reproduced snippets of real conversations between Lucas and Ethan. The house tried to regain control, adjusting its approach. Lucas didn't react. He continued moving with clear intention, avoiding comfort zones and traversing areas of greatest resistance. His growth wasn't manifested in internal dialogues, but in consistent actions. He rearranged the remaining equipment to create a continuous observation route, connecting key rooms without lingering too long in any one of them. It wasn't escape. It was conscious movement. New challenges arose when the house began simulating external normalcy. Sounds of cars on the street, distant voices, the ringing of a cell phone with no signal. It was an attempt to reconnect Lucas to the outside world, but under the terms of Sallie House. He recognized the pattern and refused to respond. Each ignored attempt weakened the effect of the simulation. The personal transformation became visible when Lucas confronted the doctor's room again, not as an investigator nor as a victim, but as someone who understood the symbolic role of that space. He removed the documents from the backpack and returned them to the exact spot where they had been found, breaking the logic of appropriation that the house encouraged. The action was simple but disruptive. For the first time, the environment reacted with genuine instability. Growth solidified when Lucas made a practical decision. to deliberately reduce his stay without abruptly abandoning the place. He began to consciously schedule rest breaks, even without physical fatigue, imposing his own rhythm on the experience. The house responded with unpredictable malfunctions, unable to anticipate actions that were driven neither by fear nor fascination. There was no clear moment of victory. There was mutual adaptation. Sallie House didn't lose its influence, but it ceased to lead the process alone. Lucas had learned to coexist without dissolving, to observe without absorbing, to remain without belonging. By the end of this stage, something had changed irreversibly, not just in him, but in the very dynamics of the place. The house seemed less cohesive, as if the cycle had been strained beyond what was expected. Lucas was no longer the same man who had walked through the door that night. And Sallie House, for the first time, seemed uncertain about its next step. The instability at Sallie House became evident in the following hours. The atmosphere no longer responded precisely to Lucas's actions. The manifestations emerged in a disorganized manner, like delayed echoes of strategies that had worked before. It was a clear sign that the equilibrium of the cycle was being forced towards an inevitable conclusion. Lucas took advantage of this flaw to act objectively. He began to shut down the subplots that were still keeping the house functional. The remaining equipment was turned off one by one, not due to technical failure, but by decision. Each camera turned off reduced the house's ability to observe itself through it. The electronic silence created an unsettling void, as if something essential was being removed from the process. In the basement, he gathered the historical objects that had been thrown out of place: surgical instruments, photographs, medical records. Instead of destroying them, Lucas repositioned them in their original spaces, restoring an order that no longer served the repetition of the cycle. The action was not symbolic, it was strategic. The house reacted with slight tremors, walls vibrating as if something were being forcibly relocated. Tension grew steadily, without premature explosions. Time began to behave erratically again. The clock advanced and retreated by whole minutes. The sky, seen through the windows, remained eternally the same dark shade, with no sign of dawn. Lucas knew that the climax would not come with a physical confrontation, but with a structural decision, something that would directly affect the functioning of the place. The final preparation occurred when the radio picked up Ethan's last transmission. The voice came through clear but emotionless, describing Sallie House as an incomplete system, dependent on human continuity to remain active. The phrase sounded not like a warning, but like confirmation. Lucas turned off the radio for the last time. There was no more outside information to consider. The house attempted one last strategy, to condense all the manifestations into a single point. The doctor's room became the epicenter. The walls darkened, the air became almost solid, and the feeling of presence reached its peak. There were no more multiple voices, no more simulations, only a concentrated, silent force, waiting. Lucas positioned himself in the hallway, maintaining a calculated distance. He would neither advance to confront nor retreat to escape. The preparation for the climax was complete when he understood that the next move should not originate from the house. It should come from him. Sallie House had been built to react, to absorb, to repeat. She wasn't prepared to be interrupted. The silence that settled in was not emptiness. It was expectation. The decisive moment didn't begin with violence, but with absence. When Lucas took his first step toward the doctor's room, nothing happened. No change in temperature, no sound, no invisible pressure. Sallie House, accustomed to reacting, remained suspended, as if awaiting a stimulus that never came. Lucas entered the room with controlled movements. The old bed was empty. The surgical instruments did not manifest themselves. The air, though heavy, did not attack. In the center of the room, where the manifestations had previously been concentrated, There was only space, raw, exposed, without narrative. It was there that the cycle was anchored. The turning point came when Lucas did something no one before him had done. He stopped acting. He didn't look for patterns, didn't assign meaning, didn't try to engage in dialogue or confront. He sat on the floor, leaned his back against the wall, and remained motionless. The action wasn't passivity. It was an active negation of the function the house demanded. The reaction was immediate and intense. The walls began to vibrate with increasing force. The floor trembled. The lights flickered on and off at irregular intervals. Sallie House attempted to condense all presences, all voices, all memories into a single manifestation. There was no defined form, only an overwhelming pressure, as if the entire environment were trying to impose itself all at once. The entity, for the first time, revealed its limitations, without someone to react, without fear, without fascination, without any attempt at control. It could not sustain its own structure. The system depended on human response to remain active. The absence of reaction was a logical breakdown. The climax reached its peak when the voices abruptly ceased. There was no explosion. There was no visible liberation. There was an internal collapse. The walls stopped vibrating. The air lost its density. The doctor's room became just an old, empty room, devoid of intention. Lucas felt the final transformation happening within him, not as a victory, but as detachment. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to keep records. He didn't need to convince anyone. His transformation was complete the moment he ceased to be necessary to the household narrative. Sallie House was not defeated. She was interrupted. The silence that followed was not threatening. It was definitive. Lucas stood up slowly, crossed the hallway, and walked to the front door. When he opened it, the cold morning air hit him with real, concrete force. For the first time since he had arrived, the outside world didn't seem so far away. As he left, the door closed by itself behind him. Without violence, without a sound, the cycle had been broken. Not by force, but by the refusal to continue playing. Dawn found Lucas sitting on the curb in front of Sallie House, his eyes fixed on the now silent facade. The house seemed ordinary again, no shadows out of place, no sense of surveillance, no weight in the air. What disturbed him most was not what might still be inside, but the total absence of response. The house no longer reacted to his presence. It was as if he had been removed from the equation. The consequences of Lucas's actions began to manifest clearly in the following hours. Mentally reviewing everything he had experienced, he realized he carried no fragmented memories, no temporal confusion, no impulse to return. The bond had been broken cleanly. Unlike previous accounts, he felt no need to explain the experience to anyone. Sallie House had left no open psychological scars. It had closed a cycle. When Ethan finally managed to locate him by phone, the conversation was brief. External records confirmed something strange. In the last few hours, environmental sensors positioned outside the house had not detected any anomalies. Old reports, available in digital archives, began to show subtle inconsistencies, as if parts of the narrative had lost cohesion. They weren't erased, but emptied of impact. The place remained famous, but less active. In the long run, the changes were even more significant. Researchers who attempted to repeat similar investigations reported frustration. The house did not respond, it did not provoke, it did not attack. It had become an ordinary historical space, deprived of the element that had made it feared. Whatever sustained it needed human continuity, and that continuity had been interrupted at the precise point. For Lucas, the most profound consequence was personal. His career took a different turn. He stopped seeking complete explanations for extreme phenomena and began studying cognitive limits, the relationship between observer and environment, and the risks of the human need for absolute control, not as an escape but as direct learning. Sallie House remained standing, motionless, integrated into the city like any other old building. But something essential had changed. It no longer chose. The story didn't end with destruction or classic redemption. It ended with closure, a rare kind of ending where silence doesn't hide threat, only absence. And sometimes, that's the most surprising thing of all. Months later, Sallie House began receiving visitors solely out of historical curiosity. There were no reports of scratches, voices, or sudden drops in temperature. Local guides enthusiastically repeated the old stories, but they realized that something had been lost along the way. The fear was no longer sustainable. In a rarely accessed university archive, an anonymous report was catalogued without much fanfare. It didn't describe any phenomena, only a concept. Systems that cease to exist when they receive no response. The author was never identified. On North 2nd Street, the house remained in absolute silence, and no one ever heard that name again, Sallie whispered in the dark. Stories like that of Sallie House survive not only because of the fear they cause, but also because of the questions they leave behind. What happens when we stop reacting to what provokes us? To what extent do environments, ideas, or narratives only exist because we continue to feed them with attention, curiosity, or fear? If this story sparked reflection in you, share your interpretation. Do you believe the cycle was truly broken or merely put on hold? Have you ever had an experience where the absence of reaction completely changed the outcome? Leave your comment, join the conversation, and share this story with anyone who enjoys true mysteries and surprising endings. Your perspective is an essential part of the narrative that continues beyond these pages.